Now we move to the next part of topic 5.4 and 5.5, the phases of the Industrial Revolution. And remember, in this topic, we're not only looking at how the Industrial Revolution spread, but also how new technology changed not only the modes of production, but also the locations of production. So in this video, we're looking at the second phase, which is known as the Western phase. So overall, we need to answer two essential questions. How did the Industrial Revolution spread? How did the Industrial Revolution change the modes and locations of production from 1750 to 1900? We pay special attention to the technology and how it shaped economic production, knowing that when we zoom back out here, there's going to be a larger picture for us to look at. So we identified the characteristics that define each phase of the Industrial Revolution in the first video. We're focusing on basically where and when, main industries, sources of power, and technologies. This is the second video where we focus on a phase. So as you take notes, describe the phase in terms of who and where, when, main industries, main power sources and resource, and then finally key technology. Because we're building up to really take a look at the big picture and see what the effect of the Industrial Revolution is. Remember that our notes should be framed by where and when, key industries, sources of power, and key technology. So this is the Western phase. And essentially, when we define the West was made up of nations that were quote unquote enlightened, mostly economically. That means capitalist, both in Western Europe and in the Americas. So there we're focusing on the United States of America. And essentially, prior to 1815, the start of this, these nations could not industrialize. But after 1815, they organized their factors of production in a way that allowed them to industrialize. So when we kind of look at why the Industrial Revolution did not spread prior to 1815, well, there's many reasons. One is that all the other nations of the world did not have the right combination of the factors of production. They might have had the land resources of coal and iron, but they didn't have the linkages such as canals or other things that would provide access to them. They might have had labor, but they didn't have the agricultural system that allowed it to proletarianize. Or they had the money. I mean, France during this time period was the richest country in the world, but they didn't have the government involvement to be able to promote the investment. Overall, they didn't have the entrepreneurs. Secondly, all these areas are dealing with other problems, meaning that the French, they're dealing with their revolution and Napoleon. Germany doesn't even exist yet and is still basically dealing with the Napoleonic Wars. And the United States is simply just trying to make itself into a nation. The biggest thing that prevented industrialization before 1815 was the lack of capital money. Most importantly, even though these areas were very wealthy, the law of limited liability had not been passed yet. The other thing is that British laws and policies prevented the trading of this industrial technology and the migration of industrial workers from England to these areas because they wanted to keep their advantage. So, starting in 1815, things began to change. First of all, we do have migration. People literally snuck out and started the Industrial Revolution both in Europe and in the United States. In Europe, there was a guy by the name of William Cockerell who snuck out of England and started a spinning factory from memory, and Samuel Slater also snuck out of Britain, moved to the United States, and made a mill in Massachusetts called the Lowell Mills, adopting not only the technology but the process of the factory system from memory. Secondly, there became a growing threat to the United States, France, and what would become Germany and other areas. And this is known as economic nationalism. Economic nationalism is very important for you to remember because what it is, it's an idea which is going to promote the growth of industrialization as the most important thing for the survival and the success of a nation. Everybody looked at England and saw how economically and politically successful they were and wanted to copy them. So this new economic nationalism is going to make industrialization a very important priority for these governments and the people. Next, the governments got involved. The governments began to pass things such as limited liability, and the governments, driven by economic nationalism, began to recruit and guarantee certain profits and certain privileges to those who invested in industrialization. Now, remember, they're still laissez faire capitalists, but now we're beginning to see a little bit of increased government involvement in the recruitment and the promises of profits. For example, in Germany, a person that invested in constructing a rail line was guaranteed profits for the first 5 years. I mean, guaranteed to get a return on their investment, no matter how much money the business lost. And that guarantee was given by the government. Finally, Britain kind of reversed it because they saw it as an opportunity to make money. So the British are going to come to certain areas, even in France, but also in the United States, and they're going to sell some older technology. And they're going to become advisors that are going to be very highly paid and kind of train the Germans to industrialize, giving them kind of an advance. So when we begin to talk about some of the technology during this age, first of all, this is when we see massive advances in transportation. On the left, we see the steamboat, and on the right, we see the first railroad, which is known as the rocket, went a grand total of 15 miles an hour. But these two things are going to drastically change everything about industrialization. Obviously, they're both powered by coal and they both use iron. So those two things are going to continue on as important resources and power sources. And since we're making stronger iron, coke also is important. But these new transportation devices, they're basically going to fundamentally change everything about industrialization. So, for example, if we look at this chart, it basically cuts travel times, good gosh, almost down by, 75%. So in Great Britain, if you were traveling between London and Edinburgh, Scotland, that was 43 hours by car. Well, the railroad cut it down to 12 and a quarter hours. And you can see the rest of it, but kind of think about how that's changing how production is and where production is. This allows certain cities to really become industrialized because now they have a means of transport other than the canals that are going to bring in the raw cotton, to bring in the coal, bring in the iron, and also take the finished goods to the coast, such as Liverpool and Brighton, to be sent out and traded in the global market. So this transportation fundamentally changes a lot about industrialization. When you talk about the Western phase, it first begins in the West, and that is Western Europe. Within this circle here, you have the most educated population. You have the brightest of the bright. the richest merchant capitalists. And so when the governments begin to get involved in France, the German Confederation, that's what Germany is known as right now, and other areas such as Belgium and the Netherlands, industrialization explodes. This area does have great deposits of coal and iron, and the railroads replace canals as the main linkage between these resources and the cities. Also, these areas begin to adopt new styles of agriculture, which is going to proletarianize the labor, allowing them to come here. Now, when we get into a little bit more specific, okay, these governments are more involved than the British government in industrialization. They did finally pass limited liability in France, the German Confederation, Belgium. They also guaranteed profits, provided tax breaks, and gave people land in order to invest. So there's a lot of motivation. Yes, this industrialization did begin in the textiles industry, but due to the extreme competition with the British and the fact they would lose to the British, very rapidly moved to other industries, kind of like a country level economic specialization. So, France, they adopted their industrialization and made their money through the creation of lacework and cannons. Germany, well, they focused on precision machinery. They improved steam engines, they created railroads, and they also specialized in weapons. As a matter of fact, one of the oldest companies in the world, the Krupp Company, was created by Frederick Krupp, a German industrialist, who was driven by economic nationalism, this idea where you had to industrialize to survive as a country, to create this industrialized monster, which basically made everything: iron production, railroads, steam engines, and also weapons. Now, the United States, on the other hand, was very similar to the British in that they really were too far away and had too much of a large population that they really needed to kind of protect itself from the British. So essentially, United States industrialization saw the government involvement simply to kind of give land and certain tax benefits for the building of the railroad. As you can see by this map here, by 1850, the ending point of this phase, we see many, many, many miles of railroad, mostly in the Northeast. We also begin to see textile mills springing up not only in Massachusetts, but also New York, New York City, and other areas that relied upon this great migration that's taking place. This is setting the stage for the United States to fulfill its manifest destiny. The idea that they are to spread all the way to the Pacific coast. So when you look at this second phase of industrialization, basically what we're talking about is we're seeing a continuation of the use of coal, iron, and coke. But you do see some new technologies. You see better steam engines, the development of railroads and steamships, and probably the biggest change or the biggest effect is that due to the competition with Great Britain and the idea of economic nationalism, governments are more involved and are going to promote different industries that allow these Western nations in Western Europe and the United States to essentially be successful.